Hello, my name's Mahan. I'm a philosophy PhD researcher and part-time lecturer in philosophy and ethics. This is part 3 of a series of videos on Plato's Republic. If you haven't seen the other videos, I recommend going back, checking out the introduction, book 1, book 2. This is going to be on book 3. Let's jump in. Book 3 has 5 main parts. It starts with the critique of Greek literature and drama, which we ended chapter 2 with. Then goes on to talk about the educational program, which involves these 2 parts of music and physical training. And then the 4th part is the introduction of the rulers, which are an elite class that are going to come from this warrior class. And this sets up the 3 different caste structures of the city and finishes this chapter with the noble lie, also known as the myth of the metals, which is a kind of caste system that Plato sets up for this ideal city based on these 3 classes. For Plato, education is the number one political issue. How you train people and what you think people should be really defines what your city is. He'd seen through his own city, which was taught by Homer, the educator of the Greeks, the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. He'd seen them fail because of their training from Homer, basically. So in this chapter, he's going back to scratch. He's really criticizing the Homeric myths that are the origins of the Greek moral system and trying to reestablish it on different footing. In this education system, it's not something that's meant to be realized in the real world like this whole city and speech, but rather an ethical standard that can be used to measure education and culture by. That's what Plato is building here. So sometimes it seems a bit strange, like why he's criticizing stories all the time, why he's talking so much about images and Homer and imitation. But really what he's trying to set up is a moral standard by which we can evaluate the culture and stories in this city they're building. He starts out by critiquing Homer that he represents evil characters that prosper. For Plato in the Athenian democracy, he'd seen his society really destroyed by vices at the time. He blames the cultural world created by Homer. One example he gives of this is that Homer depicts the underworld as a terrifying and horrible place, which creates a fear of death for soldiers. In his perfect city, the underworld will be depicted as a great place where soldiers who are brave and honorable are rewarded after death so that they won't be afraid to die in battle, and it'll motivate them. Slightly morally questionable, lying to your soldiers in order to get them to go out and get themselves killed. Yeah, ancient Greece was a pretty gnarly time. A big part of Plato's critique of Homer and the critique of images in general is that the old model for what a man should be, which is an ethical ideal really, was Achilles. Achilles is the perfect warrior. He's the guy that when the chips are down and the Trojans are winning, the Greeks go and they're like, oh man, we got to get Achilles. He's the Cristiano Ronaldo. He's the star player. He's going to come in and he's going to kill everybody, basically. But the problem with Achilles is that he's proud, he's hubristic, he's hot-headed, he's impulsive. Plato is really critiquing Achilles as the Homeric ideal, this kind of warrior king model, and replacing it with Socrates, who's going to be the philosopher king. Socrates is not dissimilar in that way to Achilles in that he wins all of the arguments. He's not killing people, but he's beating them with reason, with the love of truth, with careful thinking, with an unwavering commitment to the true, the good, and the beautiful, and even sacrificing his own life. Basically, Plato's taking the Greek stories and he's reframing them based on morality, what's called poetic justice, which is where in the stories, virtue triumphs over vice, and vice is punished, usually in a kind of ironic way, relevant to the type of vice that's committed. Whereas for Homer, he would oftentimes reward stuff like Zeus would be really lustful and go around and assault women and all these terrible things. And then he's still the king of the gods. Like, he's not a moral exemplar in that sense. Plato's trying to curate the culture and the art based on the morality, because he thinks that people's first training really is through story and through imitation. So in 393c, he critiques imitation itself, which is a really weird argument. He argues that if a poet is writing a poem, which would be like a story for us, they shouldn't pretend to be the character they're writing about. They should say, I'm a person writing about this. I'm not a god, or I'm not this character, which is really weird because Plato is literally imitating Socrates in this passage when he's writing this critique of mimesis. It's a really strange idea, but I think behind it is this idea that we should only imitate good things. Kurt Vonnegut, the American writer, said, we are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful about what we pretend to be. I think Plato's really picking up on this, which is that we don't just imitate people in real life, we imitate them in stories. And then if you write from the perspective of somebody, you take on that perspective and then you pass that perspective on to the people that inhabit that art as well. So I don't think he's saying we shouldn't create art or we shouldn't imitate it all, but rather we should only imitate the good, because if we imitate the bad, in some sense, we're scaling that for other people to do it. And Plato looks at this as the degradation of Greek society, that the more we imitate bad people, the worse it gets. We have actually an interesting example of this in our own society with social media. My own kind of social media conspiracy theory, which is the algorithm creates people who are popular at the top of social media. So people who are good at hacking the algorithm, like Mr. Beast or something like that, become very popular and successful. But then because of their popularity and success, other people then imitate them below them. So you end up with this kind of mimetic process of imitation defined by the technology. In a recent book, Cognitive Gadgets, Oxford psychologist Cecilia Hayes writes that we imitate high status people. We imitate those who are successful and above us in order to try and become successful like they are. Human beings are much more imitative than our near cousins, chimpanzees and apes. We really imitate in order to bootstrap ourselves to the next level. So I think Plato is aware of this imitation problem. And he's saying culturally we should be very careful of the people that we make successful and high status, because they're really going to define where the society is going. Jake Paul and I Show Speed are essentially defining the next generation, which is, I don't know, pretty terrifying. So after we've dealt with the problem of stories and with imitation, they've agreed that stories are only going to be told about good people with virtues that you want to emulate. We move on to a more detailed account of what this educational program is going to look like for the Guardian class. Socrates thinks of character musically, which is very interesting. It's like he thinks the training in music is going to lead to harmonious living. They look at excessive desires as like rhythms and harmonies that you don't want in your life, or disharmonies. He uses the example of excessive sexual desire as getting you out of alignment. It's like a note that's played too much in an orchestra, and so unbalances the whole unison of the orchestra harmonizing together, which is obviously Plato has an account of a person as being made of many parts. And so justice, which we'll discuss later, is a kind of inner harmony between all of these parts. So excessive desires, disordered desires, our emotions, upset this inner harmony and rhythm and lead to vice, essentially, and the corruption of character. So the point of musical education is to promote balance, harmony, self-discipline, and really living well. That to live well is to live musically. The end of this training in music and poetry is that one ought to love the fine and the beautiful. Excessive love of things like sexual desire, money, kinds of idolatry really lead to a disordered way of living, disordered harmony. The training in music teaches you to love what's fine and beautiful, true and good, and that's the best way to live. So the other half of the educational program, which is firstly training the mind with the music and then with poetry and stories, is that the body has to be trained. And Plato is pretty clear here. He recommends a kind of Spartan training regime. He argues that we won't need medicines if you're fit and healthy. People should be concerned with training physically and doing physical labor, and so that they won't become slovenly and disordered, and that won't lead to vice and the collapse of the state. He does argue against excessive care of the body, that the health overall of the soul is more important than the health of the body. You should prioritize your character over your body. I'm thinking again of a lot of Instagram people who want to just look really good, and once I look good, that's enough. Even though if you take anabolic steroids and you become a terrible person and you're angry and violent, it's like you might look physically really good, but your character is falling apart. Plato's saying that character is far more important than how your body looks. So by 410C, we really have an overview of this educational program, which is about a counterbalance. It's a moral education meant to create harmony between the different parts of the person. He thinks too much physical training will make you savage, too much music and poetry makes you soft. So you need a mix of both warrior training and literary artistic training to get a well-rounded person that they counterpoise each other. Music trains the mind, physical training shapes the body. The goal of the educational program is the overall shaping of the soul. It's a moral education that shapes the whole person. And as Plato points out, you can't have education without an account of what a person should be. This is what the virtues are, really. In Plato's case, wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. Those cardinal virtues form an ideal character, which is what a person should be. Plato really sees Socrates as embodying these virtues and hence being the kind of ideal figure for people to aim to be, which is why he's the main character of his dialogues, because he's trying to make him the new Achilles. now that we have the educational program laid out for the guardian class, which are the warrior class, in this training, you'll identify the best of the best, the masters of music and poetry and physical training. The best ones are going to be picked out, and they're going to become the rulers of the city. They're going to be the highest class ones. And Plato proposes a series of tests for them, tests of strength, tests of wit. These are going to be the people in charge of the city. They're going to be the governors, the rulers. There's always this question of who watches the watchmen. If you have dictators, if you have tyrants, if you have people in charge, who's in charge of them, essentially? And Plato wants this educational program to be in charge of them. He thinks if you educate them properly, they'll be subject to the values and truths they learn in their education, the musical way of living, and that this will filter down, that they'll be the best of the best in the education, and therefore the best and the best in ruling. He adds other constraints to them as well, in that they're meant to be aesthetics, they're not paid, they can't own property, because all of these things hold the potential to corrupt the governors and the rulers into becoming oligarchs or tyrants. And so Plato really wants to avoid that, because he wants these rulers to be philosopher kings, which we'll really get into by chapter 5, is where we go into detail in the philosopher kings. We're meant to know the truth, and they're really meant to be lovers of truth and lovers of wisdom, which is a very interesting kind of aristocratic leader that Plato proposes. But these rulers now, so we have three classes: the producer class at the bottom, the warrior class in the middle, and then we have this ruler class at the top. So we have three classes in this Platonic ideal society. And with these three classes, Plato proposes a founding mythology for the ideal city. Basically, that you're going to tell them a story, and you're going to tell them this story in order to bind them together. And the story is that they're all born from the ground, and hence all related to one another. So they all have a shared origin, essentially. And when they're born from the ground, each has a bit of metal in their soul. Some have gold metal, some have silver, and some have bronze. The gold ones are going to be the rulers, the silver are going to be the warriors, and the bronze are going to be the producers. And it's important to say, like, the Greeks don't believe in equality. Equality wasn't a Greek thing at all. This is why they invented the Olympics. The Greeks are all about the best, and they assume a natural inequality. Probably Plato's biggest weakness, I would say, is his kind of assumed inequality of people, really. He couldn't dream up the kind of Christian everybody being made in the image of God, although he does get closer than anybody else got, I would say, in his civilization. But for the Greeks, inequality is assumed. It's assumed some people are going to be slaves, some people are going to be masters, some people are going to be the best, some people aren't. This would have made more sense in their society than to our modern ears. So this is the founding mythology, and you're going to raise them with this mythology. This is why it's called the noble lie, because it's like, could you tell this lie in order to have this kind of absolute societal order, basically? And he's proposing it as a very questionable thing. It's a part of the thought experiment of the city itself. And so he's asking the question of, would this work? And he's hitting on something really important, which we'll see throughout the founding of the city, which is that big problem for ancient Athens was tribalism, feuding families, feuding houses, feuding wealthy people. And so having this origin story of a shared origin together, shared roles that you play in society that are essentially fixed with some small, he does allow for some movement between it, in terms of, you could have a silver that's born to the bronze class, or you could have a gold that's born to a silver family, and then in which case they need to move up. Because if you think about it, within the training, it's actually really rooted in their personality, in their character, into what jobs they're actually suitable for. And then the caste system is imposed on top of that. But this is Plato's way of making sense of how to have an ordered society. And if you remember what we said before, which is, once you have a perfect society, any change is degeneration. So once you have perfection, if you change perfection, it only gets worse. Plato's trying to make, in his mind, the perfect society, this aristocratic thing, and he doesn't want it to change. He wants it to be solid. Our idea of meritocracy, of people moving up and down, would be too chaotic, essentially. He wants this perfect, almost frozen society, doesn't change. Because, again, this isn't meant to be realized in reality. This is meant to be an image, a standard, a normative measure which we can employ to understand the ideal. Some important features of the noble lie are that Plato demotes the Homeric heroes like Achilles to silver, and then moves the masters of education, the philosopher kings, the rulers, to the top. So he's really done that move where he's putting Socrates above Achilles here. From this kind of three-tiered society structure later, Plato will define all of the other political structures that he pulls out. Aristocracy, which is where gold rules silver, which rules bronze. Timocracy, which is where silver rules above everybody else. Oligarchy, which is where bronze rules. Democracy, which is where everybody's just on a flat plane. And then tyranny is the bronze, the person of desire who is just in charge of everything else. So this is really a very ingenious system that Plato lays out that will help us understand not just the other political situations, but this is also where we get the tripartite psyche from that we're going to see in chapter 4. So join us for the next one.